Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are in another one of our post-show chats for the Yellow Wallpaper. I'm Lindsey Hoel-Neds, and I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator for this production. And we have some wonderful guests here today to chat a little bit about the performance and some of the context and the original story. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Brigitte, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Brigitte Fielder. I am a literature professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I specialize in US literature before 1900-ish, and especially American women writers.
Hi, I'm Janine Gardner. I was the co-director, along with my daughter Trinity, who is in class right now and could not be with us. Yeah, that's how I am involved in the project.
Great. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. So with the show, I want to start with, let's just start with Brigitte. How about you tell us a little bit about what your experience was as a literature professor watching a story that I'm sure you're familiar with throughout your studies and teaching, seeing it adapted to the stage. What was that experience for you? What was it like?
Sure. Well, I'm always interested in adaptions and revisions and repetitions of literature into various forms. And so it's always interesting to see something taken into a new medium from its original and bringing that to a different kind of audience as well.
And Janine, what made you, as a director, want to jump into doing this show? I know you and I have talked about you weren't as familiar with the story before this. So what about this kind of grabbed your attention and made you want to direct this show?
Well, Megan approached me about directing, and I was like, well, I've never heard of the work, which as I had said before, really surprised me being, I have my BS in health promotion and health equity and gender and women's studies. And so I'm in the reproductive realm of reproductive rights and justice. And so I was very surprised, having gone through gender and women's studies and having not seen this literature, presented at all. And then you did, when we did talk about this, you did say it was in a women's lit class, which then I was like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense as to maybe why I didn't. But when I read it, I was like, again, because I'm into reproductive rights and justice, and especially with anything to do with pregnancy, or post-pregnancy, it immediately grabbed my attention because of the reproductive, and the mental health and reproductive part of it. It immediately grabbed my attention, and I was like, yeah, but this is definitely something I would love to adapt. And of course, Megan is extremely talented, that I knew that any project with her singing was going to be fabulous. So that was what drew me in.
Thank you so much. Brigitte, do you want to give us a little bit, kind of a general idea of what the literary landscape was looking like in that late 19th century that Gilman was writing in? What did the American literary landscape look like, especially for women writers like Gilman?
Well, I find it really, really interesting to think of gender studies not attending to literature, because literature is such an important landscape for thinking about women's issues. And women were writing, all throughout the 19th century. This is a late 19th century work, 1892. is a bit late for my scope of American women writers. I often end courses in that moment rather than begin them. And women were writing in a wide variety of popular genres, poetry, short fiction, long fiction, and women were also avid readers of literature. And so the idea of women's kind of absence from a literary canon is a very deliberately constructed situation in studies of literature. I often find that my students don't know very many American women writers in general. When I ask them about women writers in the 19th century, they can sometimes give me Harriet Beecher Stowe, Emily Dickinson. Interestingly, one writer, Stowe, who was very, very well read, actually an aunt of Gilman, and another writer, Dickinson, who was not read overwhelmingly during her time, other than by a very small kind of margin of people. And they don't have a sense of the most popular writers of the time. And when I ask them about 19th century US literature, they name men. And so in this moment, they would be coming up with Twain, right? In the late 19th century, and they would have a large, slew of men: Twain, Poe, Hawthorne, and they would have, as a result, a kind of real skewed sense of what literature looks like in this moment, when we have women writing since the creation of the U.S. nation in this American literary landscape that wouldn't necessarily translate to its formal study in university contexts. And that's particularly because those contexts had been dominated by and had gatekeeping employed by white men. So when we start to see women writers taught more broadly in an American literary landscape, and right now I would say if you're not learning about women writers, you don't have a sense of literature, just full stop. That's half of everyone. So when that happens, it's when we have more women entering into higher education in the kind of mid to late 20th century. And so it's no surprise when we have women instructors of, say, US literature, we have attention to women's writing. And with that will come projects that we call recovery, bringing women's writing that may not have been kept in print, that may not have been preserved. A lot of writing in the 19th century appeared in periodicals, ephemera, rather than in individual volumes. And so making that literature available again in a later moment, recovered for a different kind of audience, is exactly what happened with Gilman's piece when it was published in 1973 by the feminist press. It was part of a much broader project of literary recovery. And how that shakes out is that it will align pretty particularly with this wave of feminist movements, and will be skewed in ways that are also racialized. And so the recovery of American women writers is a largely white feminist dominated project because of white feminists' kind of position in those kinds of institutions, even while alongside all of this, we have women of other races also publishing, writing profusely in any of these moments. And we also have recovery projects to keep and preserve and make available in new forms their writing as well. And so this exists, in this landscape in which women were definitely writing, but also women of color were definitely also writing in this moment and publishing broadly.
Thank you, Brigitte. That gives us like a great frame of reference. So if we're talking about these early kind of what we might say first wave feminists, and Gilman, who did not like being called a feminist, but if we look at other white suffragist, feminist writers, social advocates. Gilman often talked about her literature being more social than literary per se. If we look at that, how did they exclude women who were non-white, women who were not of a particular class, and in that discussion of moving forward, were there any kind of prominent feminist writers or thinkers that were thinking from what we would now call a more intersectional lens, or was it much more obviously advancing white women's interests, which feminism obviously has a huge history of doing throughout a large portion of its history, if we look from like kind of what we often say the first wave of feminism is?
Yeah, so this is late for first wave feminism, which extends back to at least the 1830s with the Seneca Falls Convention. And the truth is that there were always, especially Black women, in the longer, earlier feminist movement. I'm teaching a class this fall on early Black feminisms, before 1900. Feminist issues appeared in U.S. literature by women kind of throughout the century in a wide variety of genres in a wide variety of ways. I find it very, very odd, though not surprising, that Gilman doesn't identify herself as a feminist, as that continues to be a thing, but also that she articulates an odd false dichotomy between activism and literature. I find it extremely odd for someone who's related to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most popular anti-slavery novel of the whole century transatlantically, to talk about literature and activism as if they are separate, because they never have been. And women have been writing activist-oriented literature, throughout the 19th century. Anti-slavery literature is one super prominent example of literature that is activist in nature. We also have other entire genres of activist-oriented literature, like temperance literature, or racial justice literature, that's doing this kind of work. And so it's, I think, a pretense to think that literature doesn't necessarily include that kind of political orientation, even when it's not explicitly articulated. But that this is really not unusual at all by 1892. Readers of Gilman's story in that moment were likely familiar with women, both white women and other women, writing literature that was oriented towards various kinds of activism, and Black women approaching this from much more intersectional positions of thinking about feminist issues was also very, very common by then. The first story published by an African-American woman appeared in the early 1850s. That we have, and that was a story about a woman called The Two Offers by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a name that I hope people will look up. It's a story about one woman who gets married and her friend who doesn't get married, and the friend who doesn't get married lives happily ever after, though the other woman does not. And so writing about domestic issues, writing about women's heterosexual relationships is in the context of these kind of broader movements towards women's rights, is going to be quite common by the time that Gilman is publishing this story in the 1890s.
So I think you touch on, yes, so much is kind of makes us wonder about Gilman with her, I'm not a feminist, and all of these things. I think there's so many, sorry, excuse me. There are so many things about Gilman that are odd and intriguing about public statements she made about her own work, even within her own autobiography, right, when she talks about her life. So let's dive in a little bit to Gilman. Janine and I were just chatting last night about some of Gilman's specific writings about race, and about how problematic that all is. And if we think about Gilman in the context of the Yellow Wallpaper, which has been recovered, became kind of a darling of women's lit classes for a long time. And then we look at it within this context of the larger scope of Gilman's viewpoints. How do we, as modern readers or audience members, how do we put those two pieces together? How do we reflect on that? Do we have an obligation to look at it from different lenses? Do we just say, let's throw out Charlotte Perkins Gilman? What are your thoughts? And this question's for both of you, because I know Janine and I have talked about it briefly as well. So what do you think?
I can go if that's okay. This is something that I have lots of thoughts on in many different avenues, because the person can be problematic and still say and do, or usually say or write things that can still have a good impact. And I believe that's, not evil doesn't exist in a vacuum. And not to say just nothing exists in a vacuum. And while I believe that the author herself was absolutely problematic, more than problematic. I, as I was saying last night, I take a look at this work in particular, this particular piece of work, and see so much good in it that needs to be discussed. So much work that that is still relevant today. That's what I had taken from it, especially in the field that I am, with mental health, the avenues of mental health, the avenues of isolation, which we all can feel and understand right now, and how and what effect that has on, the human psyche as, as it goes, through life. And so I believe that this work in particular, I wouldn't want to throw, I don't even know if this is but wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There's some parts of this where I thought it was very effective and very, you can connect with so many parts of it, even though connecting with Gilman herself, and even like her life around that point, it for me is extremely hard. And I think, you would ask me, well, if I had known before, would I have still done the show? Part of me says no, I probably would not, knowing what her work outside of the wallpaper did for people of color, women of color, during that time period. Also, it is during a time period where this is rampant, right? This is very, very common for the time period. I still think, again, we can learn from it, but it shouldn't be like what we base things on. We've moved past it, and this piece of work in particular, we can still learn things from. I'd probably use, one that was, say written by a Black author or an author of color of the time, that still can represent the same important issues, again, that we're still dealing with today. So yes, it's really difficult because, again, nothing exists in a vacuum, and no one exists in a vacuum. And do we toss out this piece of literature that, I found pretty powerful before I heard about, before I found out about Gilman herself. It was powerful then. I can't say that just because of who Gilman was, it didn't affect me, because it did. So it's a very interesting question, and something that I think is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I mean, people often ask these questions, I think, about U.S. literature because, one studies white U.S. literature, and then necessarily must encounter any number of people with, terribly racist histories. And Gilman is, for the record, definitely a racist figure. Butler calls her a Victorian white nationalist, and that's a pretty accurate description. The fact is that many white feminist figures that have been held up and lauded did also, espouse racist positions that harmed women of color. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are some also that come to mind. They literally campaigned with a white supremacist rather than align themselves with Black women suffragists who supported the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. So, this is part of a longer history of, white feminist writing in lots of different genres in white feminist history, and this shakes out in a particular way. I think it's actually not a good literary reading to understand a text like this outside of the historical context in which Gilman is writing. And also, I think it lends, that separation lends itself to a problematic putting aside of race in this piece, because race isn't described explicitly as it is in other writing of hers, in which she literally values white babies more than other kinds of babies, or advocates for forced labor for African-American people, in which she's anti-immigrationist. And people have written about, say, Yellow Peril, which also coincides with the moment in which this is written, the association of the color yellow with racialization, and with a very deliberate wave of exclusionary immigration policies, is the historical context in which she's writing this story about yellowness. And I think that's definitely something worth discussing. Scholars have written about this very thing. But it's also, I think, important to address the fact that this is a story about a white woman. And to read this story as deracialized, to read this story as if it is just about women, or about women's mental health or women in marriage, is, I think, to misread what she represents here as a normalized experience of womanhood, when it very much was not. This is an image of privileged womanhood with which Gilman's own background aligned. Obviously, we read the biographical in this story as she has her own experience with the rest cure and this question of postpartum depression. People do this all the time with authors. It's also important to understand that she's writing this from a white woman's perspective, and this was a relation to medicine of privileged white women, people who did not work, people who could rest, people who had a very specific relation to white patriarchal power. And that is not that's not all women's experience. It's not even the majority of women's experience when we think about the privilege that's involved here. And so, so there is, I think, no responsible putting aside of race to talk about this kind of a story, because when we mark white feminism, we better understand, I think, the character at the center of this. Someone who's definitely in a position of unpower relative to her husband, but someone who can be manipulated under the guise of care in a very, very particular way because of her relationship, and who would also be in different relations of power to other kinds of women. And so the question of what kind of women Gilman wants us to identify with and have sympathy for in this piece, I think is also really important. I think that's important too for the way in which this stands in for literature about women's mental health in the 19th century, in a way that is disproportionate and skews towards white womanhood. This has become, since its recovery and republication in the 1970s, a bit of a staple for thinking about 19th century women's writing. But there are many, many other texts in which we could think about women and mental health together. One really obvious place that comes to my mind is women-authored slave narratives. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in the 1860s, predates this and is about also largely a woman's confinement and captivity in a very small space that she occupies in order to stay proximate to her children. I generally don't teach the Yellow Wallpaper, but if I did, I would teach it next to something like Jacob's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, to talk about different experiences of confinement under white male patriarchy and motherhood. Because long before Gilman, there were published renditions of other kinds of women's experiences of these things. And I think the big mistake is to let a story like Gilman's stand in for much broader conversations about this, that predate her and that are also contemporaneous with hers. And that's, I think, why I think the contextualization of this kind of literature is deeply important to being able to understand the text itself.
Thank you so much. That gives us so much to work with and to think about as we think about this piece and about the landscape in which this is created, right? So I want to talk a little bit about some choices in the production. So Janine, and Brigitte and I were talking about this a little bit before you got here. The not showing the wallpaper, because the wallpaper really becomes a character in the story, right? And like Brigitte said, right, that there has been a lot of scholarship about the color of the wallpaper, and is that representative of the yellow peril that was happening at that time, and what other symbolism might that have? And that becomes a symbol of racism and race and issues that were happening in immigration. That's how a scholar looked at it, right? And other scholars have looked at the wallpaper as being symbolic of many different things. But in our production, there was no wallpaper. It was just Megan seeing the wallpaper. So can you talk a little bit to that choice? And then I know Brigitte wanted to comment on that a little bit as well. So Janine, talk a little bit about why that choice was made, because some other productions have done this and they've had wallpaper on the wall.
Yep. We all decided, me, Trinity, Megan, the whole team decided that we didn't want the literal wallpaper. Partly for me, it was because, and I'm really glad we then afterwards had that talk about the yellow peril. I didn't want the audience fixated on the yellow wallpaper, because the yellow wallpaper becomes a living, breathing thing that, essentially in my mind, lived inside of her head. That the yellow wallpaper, or the wallpaper itself was not necessarily as important as what was behind it, as to what like sort of morphed what it morphed into. And then also I wanted the audience to sort of come up with their own version of what this wallpaper represented and looked like. And it was to me part of the mystery, and also part of giving a glimpse into the mind of, you know, the woman in the room, and why she became so fascinated with the wallpaper, which was, you know, in this production, not necessarily the wallpaper itself, but what was being revealed as she sort of became obsessed and peeled away these layers. So that was my thought. And from the very beginning, we all were like, we don't want to be literal and have actual wallpaper. And partly it was to leave it to the minds of the audience as to, you know, what it looked like, if it was there, if it was real, what was the woman, or Jane, I should say, and then, you know, what was the woman in the wallpaper, or the women in the wallpaper, whichever way you wanted to look at it. And so that was very important to me, that the audience get to decide, and leave that sort of one of the things that they were, I don't want to say confused, but that left them thinking. It made them, it made them think and want to find out more about the character herself, and what made it so fascinating.
Thank you for that explanation. First, I'll say that I absolutely loved this as an artistic decision for this particular story, because I think it really captures some of what reading the story is like. And here, you know, the wallpaper is employed through a form of ekphrasis, in which, you know, we have a detailed description of the wallpaper that we see. But what we get in the story is not one detailed description of the wallpaper. We get several detailed descriptions of the wallpaper. They are seemingly contradictory and changeable. The wallpaper itself moves in the story, and it creates a kind of confusion for the reader about what on earth this wallpaper actually looks like. It makes us, you know, it's a kind of intentionally disorienting thing about the text. And I liked that in this production, we had that similar kind of intentional disorientation for the audience, who cannot see what this woman sees. And we are not entirely sure what this wallpaper looks like. And when you see productions that have, I've seen images, even though I haven't seen another production of this, I've seen some screenshots from set designs. They vary as to what they think, you know, how they render that wallpaper, you know, which is, you know, a product of, you know, translating text to a stage production, but also I think a product of the particular form of like multiply ekphractic iterations of this throughout this very short story. And it seems that the woman herself is confused about what the wallpaper looks like, and I think it you know, it is a really interesting point about this. You mentioned this question of the woman or women in the wallpaper, and this too, I think, is a really bizarre orientation for the protagonist. You know, first she writes that she sees her jiggling the bars and moving the wallpaper, then she talks about how she's going to get up to run to help her. But then in the next moment of writing, she writes that she wants to, if she gets her out, if the woman gets out, she's going to tie her up. And so what does it mean for this white woman writer talking about her own confinement, thinking about this other woman or women in this wallpaper who, you know, seem to be struggling for mobility, who she wants to help alternately or contain, and who she imagines herself as, is such a very white feminist rhetoric when we think about the long history of talking about captivity in in the United States, and especially in white women's literature. And so, this brought to me kind of resonances of thinking about, the kind of false dichotomy that some white women writers drew between slavery and marriage, right? Well, meanwhile, Black women are writing about these things and are very full well on the difference. Even as they're writing for women's rights in many of the same areas like suffrage as white women are. And so I think the questions about the wallpaper and the contradictions about the wallpaper in terms of this woman's relationship to especially this unknown figure or figures there is something that both the story and this production leaves vague and discomforting in a way that I think is really, really appropriate to understanding the text.
For sure, absolutely. So we are getting close to our time, but I wanted to throw this out there. We could talk about this all day. There's so many issues to unpack with this production and with this story and with the time and Gilman herself and all of this. But I want to throw this out there. Do either of you have any kind of last thoughts, things that you want to leave our audiences with as they grapple with not only our production, but hopefully digging in a little more about this time period and literature and women's literature in the 19th century and all of these things? Do either of you have any kind of last thoughts for our audience?
I do, especially now. I would implore people to read actually the Yellow Wallpaper, but at the same time, I'm sorry, Dr. Fielder, what was the name of the short story you said from the slave?
Slave narrative, written by the most popular slave narrative written by a woman, Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, is something that I would highly recommend.
Yeah, so that's what I would say, is actually read them side by side. I myself am going to go find that piece of work and read it and compare it to Gilman's work, because I think that that will be illuminating, perhaps for a lot of people. I'm sure that some people would get, a lot of, they would be able to connect with Gilman's piece, and then maybe be able to get a glimpse of what life was like for actual slaves, but with the piece that was written by a slave, which is just amazing. So I thank you for that information. And that's what I would leave people with is read the piece and, take what parts of it that I think are very important regarding mental health, but know that it is from a very narrow lens, and that there is a wider scope. I think that would be good.
Yeah, I would add to that too. The urge to read other writers from the 1890s and who were contemporary with Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Some examples include Black women writers, who I'll name: Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Pauline Hopkins, Barbara Pope. People who are writing in this moment around any number of issues, including things like marriage and heterosexual domesticity in the wake of the women's movement's failure to bring voting rights to women, but who are also contending with the disenfranchisement of Black men in their households. you know, and the kind of backlash that will affect their communities as a result, that are also women's issues. I think to put into context, you know, what this particular piece of women's fiction looks like. You know, reading Black women in the 1890s, I think would kind of help that historical scope considerably.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you've given our audiences a lot of reading to do, which I'm never sad about, right? But also helping them contextualize our work as a company, as a theater company, and how we need to look to the past and look to our future and have that context to understand different art forms. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. And audience members, there are 2 other post-show chats you can watch with our other humanities experts. So thank you for tuning in, and have a wonderful day, everyone.